At my son's engagement party, someone asked who I was. Before I could answer for myself, my son smiled and said, "Oh, that's Sandra. She used to babysit me growing up. She's basically family. I am his mother." I raised him alone after his father died. I stood there in a room full of 200 strangers, holding a glass of champagne, introduced as the help. I said absolutely nothing. I finished my drink. I found my coat. I drove home. That night I made one phone call. 4 days later, my son's practice had no money left to operate on, and he had no idea I'd owned 2/3 of it the entire time. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Before we go any further, where are you watching from and how did you find this channel? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one and it genuinely means the world to me. If this story resonates with you, hit subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear it. My name is Sandra Morse. I'm 70 years old, a widow, and for 40 years I worked as an emergency room trauma nurse. The kind of career that teaches you to stay perfectly calm while everyone around you is falling apart. I used that same steadiness raising my son Bradley alone after his father died, and later when Bradley wanted to open his own dental practice, I used it again, quietly funding him in a way he never fully understood the terms of. I never expected to need the protection I'd built into that arrangement. I certainly never imagined the reason I'd finally use it would be 4 words, spoken casually at a party full of people my son wanted to impress more than he wanted to acknowledge me. I want to tell you exactly how we got to that room because the introduction wasn't really where this story started. It only felt that way to Bradley. To understand exactly what those 4 words cost my son, you have to understand what it took over the years to get an invitation into Preston Caldwell's world in the first place. Bradley met Ashley Caldwell 3 years ago at a charity gala he'd attended more out of professional networking obligation than any real interest in the cause, and I remember the particular excitement in his voice when he called me afterward, not entirely about the woman herself at first, but about her family. Mom, her father owns half the boutique hotels between here and Chicago. He'd said, the way you'd announce winning something rather than falling in love with someone. The Caldwells. You'd know the name if you paid attention to that kind of thing. I didn't pay attention to that kind of thing, and I told him so gently at the time, though I understood even then, that some part of my son had already begun measuring his own worth against a family whose wealth he could recite specifics about before he'd told me a single thing about who Ashley actually was as a person. I want to be honest that I didn't think much of it initially, beyond the ordinary hope any mother carries that her son has found someone who loves him. It was only over the following 3 years, watching Bradley's relationship with Ashley deepen into an engagement, that I began noticing something shifting in him that unsettled me considerably more than I let myself admit at the time. He started correcting small details about his own upbringing first, subtle enough that I almost missed the pattern. A mention at a dinner with Ashley's friends that he'd grown up comfortably in a neighborhood I knew for a fact had been solidly working class. The same neighborhood where his father Walter had run a small machine shop out of a rented building until the day he died of a heart attack at 51, leaving Bradley just 14 years old and me suddenly, entirely alone, raising him on a nurse's salary and whatever savings Walter had managed to leave behind. Bradley had lived that childhood beside me. He'd watched me work double shifts to keep us afloat those first hard years. And somewhere along the way, in rooms full of Ashley's family and friends, that childhood had quietly transformed in his own retelling into something considerably more polished than it had ever actually been. He started dressing differently too, small things at first. A watch considerably nicer than anything I'd ever seen him wear before. A wardrobe that seemed gradually to shed every trace of the practical, unglamorous style he'd worn comfortably his entire life prior to Ashley. And he started, most painfully of all, growing quieter and more careful about mentioning me at all in front of certain company, the way you'd grow careful about mentioning something you'd decided somewhere along the way might not reflect well on the version of yourself you were trying hardest to present. I told myself for a long while that this was simply the natural adjustment of a son marrying into a considerably wealthier world than the one he'd grown up in. That some discomfort was understandable, even expected, and that Bradley would eventually settle into a version of himself secure enough not to need to erase where he'd actually come from. I understand now, looking back, that I extended him considerably more patience than the pattern actually deserved, the same patience, I think, that had once helped me survive Walter's death in the hard years afterward, but which had quietly curdled, over time, into something closer to my own complicity in letting Bradley's shame about our modest life go unchallenged. The engagement party invitation, when it finally came, arrived through Ashley directly, warm and gracious in the particular way I'd always found genuine about her, whatever concerns I privately carried about Bradley's own transformation. "Daddy's hosting everyone at the estate," she told me over the phone. "It's going to be a big one, Sandra. I hope you'll come. Bradley's been so excited for you to finally meet everyone properly." I arrived at the Caldwell estate a little before 6 that evening, a sprawling property set back from the road behind a stone gatehouse, the kind of place that made even my own comfortable, paid-off house feel almost apologetically modest by comparison, though I want to be clear, I never once felt genuine shame about what I'd built. I'd raised my son alone on an ER nurse's salary, saved carefully every year of Walter's insurance payout rather than spending it easily, and put every bit of that discipline eventually into giving Bradley the start he needed for his own career. I had never needed an estate like the Caldwells to feel secure in what that discipline had actually accomplished. The party unfolded pleasantly enough at first, 200 guests moving easily through Preston's beautifully appointed grounds, string lights strung between old oak trees, servers circulating with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres I couldn't have named if my life depended on it. I found a quiet spot near the edge of the terrace, content to observe rather than insert myself into conversations clearly built around people who'd known each other for decades. And it was there, standing alone with a glass of champagne, that a well-dressed older woman I didn't recognize approached with polite, easy curiosity. "I don't believe we've met," she said warmly. "I'm Diane, a friend of Preston's from the club. And you are?" Bradley, standing nearby with a small cluster of Ashley's cousins, caught the question before I could open my mouth to answer it myself. He turned, smiling the same easy, practiced smile he'd give anyone he was working to impress, and said, "Oh, that's Sandra. She used to babysit me growing up, back before my parents were more established. She's basically family at this point." I felt something in my chest go very still, the particular stillness that arrives in the half-second before real pain fully lands. Diane's expression flickered with mild confusion, glancing between Bradley's easy smile and my own suddenly frozen face, clearly sensing something didn't quite add up but too polite to press further. "I am Bradley's mother. I carried him. I raised him alone through the hardest years of both our lives. I had watched him take his first steps, his first breath, and I stood in that garden, in front of a woman named Diane and everyone close enough to have overheard, introduced instead as hired help my son had quietly promoted, in his own retelling, into something more comfortably distant than the truth. I smiled at Diane. I told her it was lovely to meet her. And I understood, standing there with champagne going flat in my hand, exactly what I needed to do the moment I got home. I drove home from the Caldwell estate in a silence so complete I barely remember the actual roads I took to get there, and I sat at my own kitchen table for a long while afterward, still in my good dress, before I let myself think clearly about anything at all. I found myself eventually thinking back 15 years, further than I had and longer than I wanted to admit, to the spring Bradley finished his residency and came to me with an idea he wasn't yet confident enough to fully believe in himself. He was 29 then, working under another orthodontist downtown, restless in the way ambitious young professionals get restless when they can see the shape of the life they want but haven't yet found the means to reach it. He came to dinner one Sunday, quieter than usual, and it took him most of the meal before he finally worked up the nerve to tell me what he'd been turning over. "I want to open my own practice," he said. "I've got the training, I know the patient base in this area well enough by now. I just don't have anywhere close to the capital a startup practice actually requires. The equipment alone runs into 6 figures before you've even secured a lease." I remember watching my son across that table, 29 years old, trying so hard to sound confident about a decision that clearly terrified him, and I felt in that moment the particular ache every parent feels watching a child stand at the edge of something they desperately want but aren't yet certain they deserve. Walter had died when Bradley was 14, leaving behind a modest life insurance payout and a small machine shop I'd sold within the year, unable to run it myself and unwilling to let it slowly bleed money while I figured out what came next. I'd taken that insurance money along with everything I'd managed to save across 2 decades of nursing shifts, and I'd done what I'd learned from watching Walter build his own shop from nothing years earlier, was the only responsible way to invest in something that mattered, carefully with proper protection built in from the very beginning, rather than simply handing money over and hoping for the best. I didn't offer Bradley an outright gift. I explained to him gently that I wanted to structure my support the way Walter would have, if he'd lived long enough to help his son through exactly this moment. I would provide the capital Bradley needed, $380,000 in total, everything I'd carefully built across 2 decades, but I would structure it through a private holding company, Morse Family Holdings, that would retain majority ownership of whatever practice Bradley built, 65%, controlling and complete, with Bradley holding the remaining 35% as founder and practicing dentist. You'll run everything day to day, I told him, the same way I imagine I'd have told him if Walter himself were sitting there instead of me. Patients, staff, all the medical decisions entirely yours. I don't want you feeling like this is your mother's practice with your name stapled onto the door. I want you building something you're genuinely proud of without constantly wondering how much of it you actually earned. What I didn't explain to him in detail, and what my attorney, a careful, thorough man named Frank Delaney, structured very deliberately into the paperwork, was the exact weight of that 65%. Frank had gently suggested at the time that I might consider something closer to an even split, a structure that would feel more like genuine partnership rather than quiet, controlling protection. I remember exactly what I told him. I'm not doing this because I doubt my son, I said. I'm doing this because I watched my husband build something from nothing and understood better than Bradley does right now exactly how quickly a young practice can go sideways if the wrong pressures start shaping the decisions behind it. If something ever threatens what I've put into this, I want the legal standing to step in and protect it, for Bradley's sake as much as my own. Frank had nodded slowly at the time, and I understand now looking back that some part of me had already sensed even 15 years ago that my son's ambition might eventually outpace his sense of who he actually was underneath it. I hadn't wanted to believe that instinct fully. I'd built protection around it anyway, the same careful discipline that had carried me through Walter's death and every difficult year afterward. I never told Bradley the specific percentage. I told him simply that I was helping him get properly established, that the paperwork was handled professionally, that he shouldn't worry about the specifics because I had it taken care of. He signed what needed signing, trusting me completely, the way a son trusts a mother who has never once given him reason to doubt her intentions. I want to be honest that some part of my silence across those 15 years came from exactly the generosity I always told myself it did, wanting Bradley to feel like the success genuinely belonged to him, wanting to spare him the particular discomfort of feeling perpetually indebted, wanting him to build real confidence rather than always measuring his own achievement against how much of it he actually owed his mother. But sitting at my kitchen table that night, still in my good dress, replaying the particular ease with which my son had described me to a stranger as hired help, I understood something else about that silence I hadn't let myself examine before. I had built myself considerable protection and considerable quiet power, and I had never once used any of it, not through years of watching Bradley grow steadily more embarrassed about the life I'd actually given him, not through the small, mounting erasures of our real history that I'd noticed and quietly absorbed rather than named. I had been patient. I had extended him the benefit of the doubt again and again, telling myself it was simply the natural discomfort of a son marrying into money considerably larger than the world he'd actually come from. I understood that night that patience had quietly curdled into something closer to letting my own identity be rewritten without objection, and that the introduction to Diane wasn't really the injury itself. It was simply the first time Bradley had made that rewriting impossible for me to keep pretending I hadn't noticed happening for years. I picked up the phone and called Frank Delaney. Frank picked up on the third ring, considerably later than his usual office hours, and I could hear, even through the particular flatness of a phone line, the immediate shift in his attention once I told him I needed to see him properly, not just a quick call. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "First thing. Whatever this is, Sandra, I can hear in your voice it's not nothing." I didn't sleep especially well that night, replaying that garden conversation with Diane on a loop I couldn't quite silence. But I arrived at Frank's downtown office a little before 8 the next morning with a clarity I hadn't expected to feel given how little rest I'd gotten. Frank's office hadn't changed much since he'd first drawn up the Morse family holdings paperwork 15 years earlier. The same heavy oak desk, the same careful, unhurried manner that had made me trust him with something this significant in the first place. I told him everything start to finish. The years of Bradley growing quieter about mentioning me, the small rewritten details of his own childhood, and finally the engagement party itself. The introduction to Diane, the words basically family, the particular, precise cruelty of being reduced to former hired help in front of 200 strangers by the son I'd raised entirely alone. Frank listened without interrupting, the same careful stillness he'd always brought to serious conversations, and when I finished he sat back in his chair and studied me for a long moment before he spoke. "Sandra," he said, "I want to make sure I understand what you're actually asking me. Are you here because you want to explore your options, or because you've already decided what you want to do and you need me to help you execute it properly?" I thought about that question carefully before I answered, because I understood it mattered considerably to how the rest of this conversation would unfold. "I think I've already decided," I told him. "I don't want to destroy my son, Frank. I want him to understand clearly and completely exactly what he's been quietly erasing about who he actually is and where he actually came from. But I'm no longer willing to simply absorb that erasure and call it patience." Frank nodded slowly and reached for a thick folder I recognized with a small jolt, as the original Morse family holdings paperwork, still carefully maintained after all these years. "Let's start with what you actually have standing to do," he said. "As majority owner holding 65% of the holding company, you retain full legal authority to review Riverside Orthodontics financial records at any time, without needing Bradley's permission, under the operating agreement we structured originally. If that review reveals mismanagement, funds diverted for personal expenses inconsistent with the practice's stated operations, financial decisions made without proper authorization, you have clear legal grounds to intervene directly, including freezing accounts pending formal review, and reasserting operational oversight if the mismanagement is significant enough. I want that review done properly," I told him. "Not assumptions, not simple hurt feelings dressed up as financial concern. I want to know factually whether there's actually been mismanagement, because I don't want to act purely out of the pain of one terrible conversation at a party. I want to explain something about that particular request, because I think it matters to understanding the kind of correction I was actually seeking." I hadn't called Frank that morning purely out of wounded pride, however real that pain genuinely was. Some steadier part of me, the same part that had spent 40 years staying calm in emergency rooms while everyone around me fell apart, needed to know that whatever intervention I was about to set in motion was actually justified by fact, not simply by a single devastating sentence spoken carelessly in a garden. Frank brought in a forensic accountant within the week, a careful, thorough woman named Priscilla Doyle. A name Frank mentioned came highly recommended, someone he'd worked with on similar matters before, and it took her just under 2 weeks to compile findings that landed considerably harder than I'd braced myself for. Over the preceding 2 years, Bradley had authorized $58,000 in practice expenses that Priscilla's report characterized, in careful professional language, as having no clearly documented business purpose consistent with the practice's stated clinical operations. The specifics told their own story clearly enough. A complete renovation of Bradley's own home office and entryway, charged to the practice as clinic aesthetic consulting, timed suspiciously close to the first occasion Ashley's parents had visited. A luxury vehicle lease run through the business under staff transportation, despite Bradley being the only person who'd ever driven it. 2 separate gifts purchased for Preston Caldwell. A rare bottle of scotch, a membership to a private club Preston already belonged to twice over, both categorized in the practice's books as professional networking. "This isn't simply poor judgment," Frank told me, once he'd walked me through Priscilla's full report. "This is a sustained pattern of using practice funds to finance his personal pursuit of the Caldwell family's approval, disguised through improper expense categorization. Combined with everything else you've described, Sandra, this gives you more than sufficient grounds to intervene." I sat with that finding for a long while, feeling something considerably more complicated than simple vindication. 15 years of careful, patient investment, and my son had spent the last 2 years quietly funding his pursuit of a family's acceptance with money that was never fully his to spend that way in the first place. The same family in whose garden he'd erased me entirely rather than risk them learning the truth about where that money had actually come from. "I want to move forward," I told Frank. "Carefully and properly, exactly the way we built this structure to allow. But Frank, I want you to understand something important before we do. I'm not doing this to punish him permanently. I'm doing this because I think somewhere underneath everything Bradley has become chasing the Caldwell's world, there's still a version of my son worth fighting for. I want to give him the chance to prove that's true, and I want him to finally understand exactly who he's actually been erasing this whole time." Frank nodded, already reaching for the paperwork that would formally initiate the account freeze, and I understood, watching him work, that whatever came next would move considerably faster, and considerably more completely, than my son had any reason to expect. Frank advised me it would take 3 business days for the formal freeze notice to process through Riverside Orthodontics Bank, and he suggested gently that I might want to prepare myself for how quickly and how urgently Bradley would likely react once it did. I didn't fully understand what he meant until my phone began ringing that Thursday morning, a little before 10, Bradley's name lighting up the screen with a frequency that felt, within the first hour alone, almost frantic. I let the first several calls go to voicemail, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely needed a little time to steady myself before I spoke with him directly, understanding that whatever conversation came next would likely be one of the hardest of both our lives. By early afternoon I'd counted 14 missed calls. By evening the number had climbed past 30. Frank had warned me this might happen, explaining that the freeze notice, once it hit the bank, would have prevented Bradley from accessing payroll accounts, the vendor accounts covering his dental supplies, essentially every financial mechanism his practice required to function day to day, effective immediately and without any advance warning to him personally, exactly as the original operating agreement allowed. I finally answered on the 38th call, a little before 8 that evening, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. "Mom, thank God," Bradley said, his voice carrying a raw, unguarded panic I hadn't heard from him in years. "Something's happened with the practice accounts. Everything's frozen. I can't run payroll for my staff. I can't order supplies I need for tomorrow's appointments. The bank keeps referencing some kind of legal hold tied to Morse family holdings, but I don't even fully understand what that is." I felt my chest tighten hearing the genuine fear in his voice, and I understood in that moment exactly how much this conversation was going to cost both of us. "Bradley," I said carefully, "I think it's time we talked properly in person with Frank present. I don't think this is something we should try to work through over the phone." "Mom, I don't have time for a formal meeting," Bradley said, his voice rising. "I have patients scheduled all week and staff I need to pay by Friday. I need to understand what this legal hold actually is and how to get it lifted today, not next week." "Frank's office," I told him, giving him the address and a time 2 days out, the earliest slot Frank's schedule genuinely allowed. Bring Ashley if you'd like. I think, given everything, she deserves to understand what's actually happening too. He called 82 times in total over the following 4 days, according to Frank's own careful count once we compared notes afterward, though I stopped answering after that first Thursday evening conversation, understanding that further calls before the scheduled meeting would only escalate an already difficult situation without accomplishing anything productive. I did text him once briefly the day before our meeting. I love you. I'll see you Tuesday. We'll work through this together. He didn't respond. Frank called me the day before the meeting with an update that added a layer I hadn't fully anticipated. Bradley attempted yesterday to secure an emergency line of credit against the practice to cover payroll, he said. The loan officer, standard practice for a request of that size, pulled the practice's full ownership records as part of underwriting. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Sandra, I believe your son learned for the first time exactly how the practice was actually structured from a stranger at a bank, rather than from either of us directly. I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling a particular grief settle over me that I hadn't fully anticipated. I had wanted Bradley to learn the truth from me in a controlled setting, with Frank present to explain the legal specifics clearly and calmly. Instead, he'd apparently discovered, in the middle of a panicked attempt to save his practice, that his mother owned nearly 2/3 of everything he'd spent 15 years believing was entirely his own, learning it from a loan officer's paperwork rather than from any conversation, any context, any explanation that might have softened even slightly how devastating that discovery must have felt. How did he react? I asked Frank, though some part of me already dreaded the answer. The loan officer described him as visibly shaken, Frank said. He apparently asked to see the ownership documentation directly, confirmed the 65% figure himself, and left without completing any further paperwork. Frank's voice softened slightly. Sandra, I think by Tuesday your son isn't simply going to be angry about frozen accounts. I think he's going to be reckoning with something considerably larger about his entire understanding of the last 15 years of his own life. I thought about that warning carefully over the following day, understanding that whatever I'd hoped Tuesday's meeting might accomplish now carried a weight I hadn't fully anticipated. I had wanted this correction to feel firm but controlled, a clear demonstration of consequences delivered with love still visible underneath it. I worried now that Bradley would arrive at Frank's office already convinced, before I'd said a single word, that everything about our relationship over the past 15 years had been some kind of quiet deception rather than the protective generosity I'd always genuinely intended it to be. I called Frank back that evening with one final request before Tuesday's meeting. I want to speak first, I told him. Before anyone raises the financial specifics, before we discuss the expense findings, before any of the legal mechanics. I want the chance to explain, in my own words, exactly why I structured things this way 15 years ago, and exactly what it actually meant. I'll make sure you have that chance, Frank promised. Sandra, for what it's worth, I think that's exactly the right instinct. Whatever else happens Tuesday, I think your son needs to hear directly from you that this was never really about control at all. I hung up that evening and sat for a long while in my own quiet living room, thinking about the small boy who used to run to me with skinned knees, and the man he'd become, currently somewhere across town discovering that his entire adult success had been quietly protected by a mother he'd introduced to a stranger as former hired help. Tuesday couldn't come soon enough, and I dreaded it more than almost anything I could remember dreading in years. Frank's conference room felt considerably smaller that Tuesday morning than it ever had during our previous meetings, though I understood the room itself hadn't changed at all, only the weight of what was about to happen inside it. Bradley arrived first alone, which surprised me slightly given that I'd invited Ashley to attend as well. He looked, sitting down across the table from me, considerably more haggard than the polished, confident man who'd stood in his fiancée's garden 2 weeks earlier introducing his own mother as former hired help. Dark circles beneath his eyes, a tightness in his jaw that told me he hadn't slept much better than I had. "Ashley's coming separately," he said, his voice flat, careful. "She's bringing her father." I felt something tighten in my own chest hearing that, understanding immediately that Preston's presence would change the shape of this conversation considerably, though I said nothing beyond a simple nod, waiting for Frank to guide us through what came next. Ashley and Preston arrived perhaps 10 minutes later. Preston dressed impeccably as always, his expression carrying a controlled curiosity that told me he genuinely didn't yet understand the full scope of what this meeting concerned. Ashley looked pale, uncertain, glancing between her fiancé and me with an expression I recognized as someone caught entirely off guard by a crisis she didn't yet have the context to fully process. Frank opened the meeting with careful, measured formality, explaining briefly that this concerned a financial and legal matter related to Riverside Orthodontics' ownership structure, before turning the floor over to me exactly as he'd promised. I looked at my son directly, and I found the words I'd rehearsed the night before came out steadier than I expected. "Bradley, 15 years ago when you came to me wanting to open this practice, I made a decision I should have explained to you more fully at the time, and I take responsibility for the confusion that decision has clearly caused. I structured my investment through a holding company, Morse Family Holdings, which retained 65% ownership of what became Riverside Orthodontics. I did this for 2 reasons. I wanted you to build genuine confidence running your own practice without constantly feeling indebted to your mother. And I wanted the legal standing to protect what I'd invested for both our sakes, if anything ever went seriously wrong." "You owned my practice this whole time," Bradley said quietly, "and you never told me the actual number." "I told you I was helping you get properly established," I said. "I understand now that wasn't the same as full honesty, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise sitting here today. I made a choice 15 years ago to protect you from a burden I thought might weigh on you, and I understand now that choice also kept you from fully understanding the actual foundation your success was built on." Preston, who had been listening with an increasingly guarded expression, finally spoke. "I'm sorry, I need to understand something clearly. Are you saying Bradley doesn't actually own his own practice?" "Bradley owns 35% of it as founder and practicing dentist," Frank said, stepping in smoothly. "Morse Family Holdings, controlled by Mrs. Morse, has held the majority interest since the practice's founding." I watched something shift visibly across Preston's face, a recalculation happening in real time that I recognized instantly, having spent decades watching people absorb difficult news in emergency rooms across countless shifts. Whatever version of Bradley he'd believed he was welcoming into his family, self-made, established, a rising professional in his own right, was rearranging itself, right in front of him, into something considerably smaller and more precarious. Frank moved next into Priscilla's findings, laying out the $58,000 in improperly categorized expenses with the same careful, unemotional precision he brought to everything, walking through the home office renovation, the luxury vehicle lease, the scotch and the club membership purchased for Preston himself and run through the practice's books as professional networking. I watched Bradley's face as each item was read aloud, watched the particular sinking recognition of a man realizing exactly how thoroughly his own careless decisions had documented themselves, and I watched, too, something shift in Preston's expression as he understood, piece by piece, that gifts meant to court his own approval had all been funded improperly, through money that legally belonged largely to Bradley's mother rather than to Bradley himself. "I want to be direct about where this leaves things," Frank said, once he'd finished walking through the findings. "Given the scope and pattern of these expenses, Mrs. Morse has clear legal grounds, under the original operating agreement, to assume direct operational oversight of the practice, effective immediately pending further review." "You can't just take my practice," Bradley said, his voice cracking now, some of the shock finally breaking into something raw. It was never entirely your practice to begin with, Bradley, I said gently, though I made myself hold his gaze as I said it. I understand how painful that is to hear. But I need you to understand something else clearly right now in this room. The freeze isn't punishment for its own sake. It's a consequence directly connected to specific decisions you made, decisions I have documented proof of. I paused and found myself saying the next part before I'd fully decided to, some old, patient restraint finally giving way after 2 weeks of carrying it silently. And Bradley, I want everyone in this room to hear this clearly too, since apparently it needs saying plainly. I am your mother. Not someone who babysat you. Not basically family. Your mother who raised you entirely alone after your father died, who worked double shifts to keep us afloat, who saved every dollar I could for 2 decades so that you would never once have to start your career the way I had to start my own adult life. With nothing and no one behind me. The room went very quiet. Ashley's eyes filled with tears, and she looked at Bradley with an expression I couldn't fully read, though it carried something closer to genuine grief than anger. Preston stood abruptly, smoothing his jacket with the particular composure of a man recalibrating his position in real time. Ashley, I think we should give Bradley and his mother some privacy to work through this. I watched my son's face as Preston said it, watched him understand in that exact moment, something I suspect some part of him had already begun sensing even before the meeting started, that whatever regard Preston had shown him across 3 years of courting Ashley's family had been considerably more conditional than he'd allowed himself to believe. Preston, Bradley said, and I heard in his voice a genuine, desperate hope that he might stay, might reassure him, might prove that whatever mattered to him about Bradley extended beyond the version of success he'd worked so hard to project. I can explain all of this. This doesn't change anything, does it? Preston's expression softened briefly into something almost apologetic. I think you and your mother have quite a lot to discuss, Bradley. Ashley, I'll wait for you outside. He left the room without another word, and I watched my son's face as the door closed behind him, understanding with a grief that surprised me in its intensity, exactly how completely his entire carefully constructed world had just begun collapsing in front of him. Ashley lingered in the doorway a long moment after her father left, her expression caught somewhere between loyalty to Bradley and the same visible recalculation I'd watched cross Preston's face minutes earlier. But unlike her father, she didn't simply leave. She crossed the room instead and sat down beside Bradley, taking his hand, though I watched something careful and searching in her eyes as she did it. I need you to explain this to me properly, she said, not the legal parts, Frank already made those clear enough. I need to understand why you'd introduce your own mother the way you did in my parents' garden. I need to understand what that actually says about you, Bradley, because right now I genuinely don't know. Bradley didn't answer right away, and I watched him sit with the question, his jaw working silently for a long moment before he finally spoke, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. I was ashamed, he said quietly. Not of Mom. I want that to be clear, even though I understand it doesn't excuse anything. I was ashamed of where I actually came from, compared to everything your family has. I've spent 3 years feeling like I was constantly proving I belonged in rooms like your father's garden, and somewhere along the way I convinced myself that meant hiding the parts of my own story that felt too far beneath all of it. Your mother isn't beneath anything, Ashley said, her voice sharp now, genuine anger finally breaking through the careful composure she'd been holding since Frank first laid out the ownership structure. Your mother raised you alone, worked double shifts, and used every dollar she had to give you a career. And you stood in my parents' garden and called her the babysitter. She shook her head slowly, tears finally spilling over despite her obvious effort to hold them back. I need some time, Bradley. I need to think about what it means that you do that, and what else you might have hidden or reshaped that I don't know about yet. She left shortly after that, without the small, ordinary gesture of comfort I imagined she'd have offered him without hesitation 2 weeks earlier, and I watched my son's shoulders drop as the door closed behind her, understanding that he'd registered that absence as clearly as I had. Frank gave us a few minutes alone once the room had emptied, stepping out under the pretense of retrieving additional documents, and I sat across the table from my son in a silence that felt heavier than almost anything I could remember between us. Preston left the second things got complicated, Bradley finally said, staring at the table rather than at me. 3 years of trying to prove I belonged at that table, and the moment he found out I wasn't exactly who I'd let him believe I was, he couldn't get out of the room fast enough. I noticed, I said gently. I keep thinking about what I actually said in that garden, Bradley continued, his voice cracking. Basically family. Mom, I don't even fully understand why I said it. Diane asked a simple question and something in me just panicked, I think, at the idea of explaining that my mother raised me alone on a nurse's salary in a neighborhood nothing like anywhere near that estate. I've spent 3 years slowly editing that story every time I told it, and I don't think I even noticed how far it had drifted from the truth until I heard myself say those exact words out loud. I didn't say what I was thinking in that moment, though I suspect Bradley understood it anyway, sitting there in the wreckage of a meeting that had exposed considerably more than just financial mismanagement. Preston's swift exit hadn't been an isolated reaction to a single difficult conversation. It had been, I think, an honest revelation of exactly how conditional his regard for Bradley had always actually been, dependent entirely on the version of success he'd worked so hard to perform in that world. What followed over the next 10 days moved with a speed that surprised even Frank, I think, given his considerable experience with families navigating exactly this kind of upheaval. Ashley called Bradley 5 days after that meeting, according to what he told me later, to inform him she needed to postpone the wedding indefinitely, though she was careful, he said, to clarify she wasn't ending things entirely, only that she couldn't move forward with any real certainty until she understood who Bradley actually was beneath everything he'd apparently been performing for her family. I understood, hearing that distinction, that whatever chance remained for Bradley and Ashley now depended entirely on choices my son hadn't yet made. Preston, for his part, made his own position considerably clearer within the same week, according to a brief, careful conversation Ashley apparently had with Bradley about her father's reaction. Preston had, she reportedly told Bradley, expressed genuine concern about the kind of judgment that would lead a grown man to publicly erase his own mother's identity, framing it not simply as an isolated social misstep but as a troubling indicator of character he wasn't certain he wanted his daughter permanently bound to. I don't think he's ever going to fully trust me again, Bradley told me during a phone call about 2 weeks after that first meeting, his voice steadier than it had been that day in Frank's office, though carrying a rawness that told me he was still very much in the process of absorbing everything that had happened. And Mom, I keep thinking, if I'm honest, that maybe he shouldn't. I did something genuinely unforgivable in that garden. I'm not sure trust is something I actually deserve to have handed back easily from anyone. I don't need you to have all of that fully sorted out today, I told him honestly. I need you to actually sit with what you did, Bradley, rather than rushing toward whatever explanation makes you feel better about it fastest. That's part of what comes next if you're willing to do the work. What does that actually look like? He asked quietly. What do you need from me now? I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered, understanding that whatever I said next would shape the entire direction of what came after this devastating, necessary reckoning. I think, I told him, it's time we talked about what it would actually take to earn back some real stake in this practice. Not given to you out of guilt or sentiment, Bradley. Earned properly. The same way I once hoped you'd have built your entire sense of self all along, without needing anyone else's garden or anyone else's approval, to feel like it was worth something. Bradley came to my house the following Sunday, the first time he'd sat at my own kitchen table in longer than either of us wanted to acknowledge, and I made the same pot roast I'd made for his birthday every year since he was a boy, understanding that some conversations go easier with ordinary comfort surrounding them. We didn't talk business through most of the meal. I asked him how he was managing, practically, how patients were being handled with the practice's finances still under review, whether he'd heard anything further from Ashley, how he was sleeping. He answered honestly, without the polish I'd grown used to hearing from him over the past several years, describing a version of himself I hadn't seen since he was young and still uncertain enough to admit when things felt hard. It was over coffee, once the dishes were cleared, that I finally raised what I'd been thinking through carefully since our phone call. "I want to propose something," I told him, "and I want you to understand clearly that this isn't a punishment, though I imagine parts of it will feel that way. I want to give you the chance to earn back a meaningful stake in Riverside Orthodontics. Not the full 65% and not simply handed to you out of guilt or sentiment. Earned." "What would that actually require?" Bradley asked, his voice careful, the particular wariness of a man who'd already learned painfully not to assume anything about how the next weeks of his life might unfold. $100,000, I told him. "Raised entirely on your own within 30 days, to buy back an additional 15% stake in the practice. Not borrowed from friends, not financed through any arrangement that simply shifts the debt somewhere else. Earned and saved through your own effort in a way I can verify clearly." I watched him absorb that figure, watched the particular mathematics of it settle over his face as he worked through, I imagine, exactly how far that number sat from anything his current circumstances could reasonably produce, especially with the practice's accounts still under review and his own personal savings considerably depleted by years of expenses meant to impress people who'd since largely abandoned him. "Mom, that's an incredibly difficult amount to raise in 30 days. I don't have anywhere close to that saved, and I'm not even certain what my income looks like right now with everything still frozen." "I understand it's a difficult target," I said. "I want to be honest with you, Bradley, that the difficulty is somewhat the point. I don't need you to reach the exact number. I need to see clearly and honestly what you're actually willing to do and what you actually value, once the version of your life built to impress the Caldwells is no longer available to you." He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table between us, and when he finally spoke, something in his voice had shifted into a resolve I hadn't heard from him in years. "What happens if I don't reach it?" he asked. "What happens if I fall short?" "We'll see," I told him honestly. "I'm not going to tell you the answer to that right now because I think knowing it in advance would change how genuinely you approach the next 30 days. I want you to give this everything you actually have, Bradley, not calculate toward whatever minimum guarantees a particular outcome." He agreed that same evening, and over the following days I watched, mostly from a careful distance, as my son began dismantling the visible markers of the life he'd spent the past several years building. He sold the watch he'd started wearing sometime after meeting Ashley, listing it himself through an online marketplace rather than asking anyone for help navigating the process. He sold the luxury vehicle he'd been leasing through the practice, replacing it with a used compact he paid for outright in cash, considerably less impressive but entirely his own. He took a second job in the evenings once patient volumes slowed while the practice worked through its financial review, staffing the front desk of an urgent care clinic across town, a position considerably beneath his training but one that paid honestly hour by hour, for work he actually performed. On weekends he picked up shifts doing basic dental hygiene work at a community health clinic that served patients regardless of ability to pay, a position Frank happened to mention had been recommended to Bradley by Priscilla herself, who apparently had connections there from her own broader work with financial recovery cases. I didn't check in constantly during those 30 days, understanding that hovering would undermine exactly the kind of genuine independent effort I was hoping to see. But I heard pieces of it from Frank, from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned running into Bradley at the community clinic looking exhausted but focused, from Bradley himself during the brief, occasional calls he made simply to check in rather than to ask for anything. "I worked with a woman today who reminded me so much of you," he told me during one of those calls, somewhere around the 2-week mark, his voice carrying an exhaustion that sounded, to my careful ear, considerably more honest than anything I'd heard from him in years. "She'd been putting off dental care for months because she couldn't afford it anywhere else, and I got to actually help her, Mom, not bill anyone, not think about margins or what it looked like. Just help her. I haven't felt that in longer than I want to admit. How does that feel? I asked him. He was quiet a long moment before he answered. Like remembering something, he finally said. I think I forgot somewhere in the last few years why I actually wanted to become a dentist in the first place. It wasn't for a watch or a car or a garden full of people I was trying to impress. I think I forgot that a long time before that party ever happened, Mom. The party just finally made it impossible to keep pretending I hadn't. I didn't tell him in that moment how much that particular observation meant to me, how closely it echoed exactly the kind of reckoning I'd hoped, quietly, this entire ordeal might eventually produce in him. I simply told him I was proud of the effort I could see him making, and let the conversation end there, understanding that whatever transformation was actually happening in my son needed room to continue developing on its own, without my interference shaping it prematurely. The 30 days drew to a close on a Thursday evening, and Bradley asked if he could come by my house that Friday to report formally exactly where he'd landed. I found myself waiting for him that Friday afternoon, considerably more nervous than I expected to feel about a number I'd already told him. Honestly, wasn't really the point of any of this at all. Bradley arrived Friday afternoon carrying a folder, the particular formality of it striking me immediately, given that I hadn't asked him to document anything in writing. He'd clearly decided on his own that this final accounting deserved the same seriousness I imagine he'd once brought to important patient case presentations, back when presentations were still the currency he traded in most comfortably. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table that had hosted every significant conversation of this entire ordeal, and I watched him open the folder with hands that weren't entirely steady. $51,000, he said, sliding a summary sheet across the table toward me. That's what I raised. I know it's considerably short of 100,000. I looked over the document carefully, understanding from decades of staying steady through exactly this kind of difficult moment professionally, precisely how much effort sat behind each line. The watch sold for 9,000. The vehicle lease buyout, netting 14,000 once he'd settled what remained on the financing. 4 weeks of combined wages from the urgent care front desk and the community clinic weekend shifts, totaling just under 19,000 once he'd covered his own modest living expenses. The remainder came from what appeared to be nearly everything else of value Bradley owned. A small collection of expensive shoes sold through a resale service, professional equipment he'd purchased but rarely used, even, I noticed with a particular ache, a set of hand tools that had belonged to his father. Items I recognized immediately from Walter's old machine shop, understood must have cost him something considerable to part with, regardless of their modest resale value. You sold your father's tools, I said quietly. I needed every dollar I could find, Bradley said, and then more quietly, I almost didn't. I sat with that box for 2 days before I finally listed anything from it. I kept thinking about how little I actually remember about Dad, honestly, since I was so young when he died, and how those tools were one of the only physical things I had left that felt like they actually connected to him. He paused, and I watched something genuine cross his face, unguarded in a way I hadn't seen from him in years. But then I thought about what you actually gave me 15 years ago, Mom, and how I paid it back by erasing you entirely in front of 200 strangers. The tools felt like the least I could offer toward actually fixing that, even though I understand now that no amount of money was ever really going to fix it on its own. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling my own composure waver slightly in a way I hadn't expected it to, given how carefully I'd prepared myself for this conversation. There's something else, Bradley continued, reaching back into the folder. I want you to see this too, even though it doesn't add to the total. He slid out a second document, a printed schedule of hours worked across the urgent care clinic and the community health clinic, each shift logged carefully. I worked 186 hours over these 30 days, on top of whatever practice hours I could still manage while the accounts were under review. I've never worked that many combined hours in a single month in my entire life, not even during residency. Tell me about the work itself, I said. Not the numbers. what it actually felt like. He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. The urgent care front desk was humbling in a way I didn't expect, he said. Answering phones, checking in patients, doing work I would have considered beneath me a few months ago without even fully realizing I felt that way about it. But the community clinic was what actually changed something in me, I think. Working on patients who had no other options, no insurance, sometimes not even reliable transportation to get there, and realizing how completely I'd lost sight of that version of medicine, chasing something considerably more superficial for the last several years. His voice caught slightly. I kept thinking somewhere around week 2 about every choice I've made since meeting Ashley that had nothing to do with becoming a better dentist or a better person, and everything to do with looking a certain way to people who, honestly, were never going to fully accept me regardless of how hard I performed for them. I reached across the table and took my son's hand, the same way I had through every significant crisis of his life, and I found myself in that moment, understanding with total clarity that the number sitting between us, $51,000, $49,000 short of the target I'd set, mattered considerably less than everything he'd just described. Bradley, I said, I need to tell you something honestly and I need you to really hear it. I never expected you to reach $100,000 in 30 days, especially with the practice's own finances still under review limiting your regular income. I don't think it was possible, and some part of me suspected that when I set the number. He looked up at me, confusion crossing his face. Then why? Because I needed to see what you were actually willing to sacrifice when the goal felt impossible, I told him. Anyone can perform effort toward a target they know they'll hit comfortably. I needed to see what you'd give up and how honestly you'd work, once you understood the odds were genuinely against you. I needed to know whether you'd quietly cut corners, or simply give up 2 weeks and once it became clear you'd fall short. Instead, you sold your father's tools and worked 186 hours in a month doing work that finally meant something again. And you came here today with an honest accounting rather than any attempt to dress up the number into something it wasn't. Bradley sat very still, absorbing that, and I watched tears finally, genuinely fill his eyes for the first time since this entire ordeal began. So this was never really about the money, he said slowly. The money was real, I told him. The consequences were real and I don't regret a single one of them. But Bradley, what I was actually watching for this entire time was you. Who you'd choose to become. Once the version of yourself built for Preston Caldwell's garden was no longer available to you at all. I let Bradley sit with that revelation for a long moment before I continued, watching him absorb piece by piece, that the entire 30-day ordeal had never actually been a test of arithmetic at all. I want to tell you what happens now, I said, and I want you to understand this isn't simply forgiveness handed to you because you're my son. This is a decision I've thought through carefully, based on what I've genuinely watched you do these past weeks. I reached into my own folder, one I'd prepared before he arrived, and slid a document across the table toward him. I'm restoring an additional 20% stake in Riverside Orthodontics to you, effective immediately, held under Frank's continued oversight for the first 2 years, with standard financial reporting requirements built in that I expect you to meet without complaint. That's 5% more than the target we set, Bradley, not because you earned it back through the $51,000, but because you earned it back through everything that number actually represented. Bradley stared at the document, and I watched his hands shake slightly as he read through the terms. 55% for me, he said quietly. Mom, I fell $49,000 short of what you asked for. I know exactly how short you fell, I told him. I also know you sold your father's tools, worked 186 hours in a single month at jobs stripped of every status marker you'd built your recent identity around, and came to this table today with total honesty rather than any attempt to inflate what you'd actually accomplished. That matters more to me than the number ever did. I paused and found myself moving toward the harder part of what I needed to say, the part that had nothing to do with the practice at all. There's one more thing, Bradley, and I think this matters even more than the stake in the practice. I want you to understand clearly that I'm not simply your mother in some formal legal sense that occasionally gets mentioned in a conference room. I raised you alone. I gave everything I had financially and otherwise, to make sure you never had to start your adult life the way I had to start mine. And I need you to never again in any room with any family, describe me as anything less than exactly who I actually am to you. Bradley's eyes filled with tears again, and this time he didn't try to hold them back. I don't know how I'll ever fully make up for that garden, he said. I don't know how to undo what I said or how many other small moments there might have been before that, where I let people believe something less than the truth about you, about us, about where I actually came from. You don't need to make up for all of it in one conversation, I told him gently. I think that's actually part of what I want you to understand moving forward. This isn't a debt you're paying off completely today. It's a relationship we're going to keep rebuilding slowly, the same way any genuine trust gets rebuilt, through ordinary, consistent choices, rather than one grand gesture that fixes everything at once. We had dinner together that following Sunday, the first of what would become, over the coming months, a steady rebuilt tradition between us. Ashley joined us for that dinner too, at Bradley's invitation, having spent the preceding weeks in careful, honest conversation with him about exactly what she needed to see before she felt ready to move forward with any wedding at all. It was near the end of that dinner, once the dishes had been cleared, that Bradley did something that undid me more completely than almost anything else across this entire ordeal. He stood the way he had at that garden party months earlier and raised his glass, and I felt myself brace, some old instinct expecting another performance. I want to say something properly, he said, looking at Ashley first and then at me. This is my mother, Sandra Morse. She raised me entirely on her own after my father died, working double shifts as an ER trauma nurse for years to keep us afloat. Every single thing I've ever built professionally exists because she saved every dollar she could for 2 decades and believed in me enough to invest it, carefully and completely, in a future I hadn't yet proven I deserved. His voice caught and he looked directly at me. She is not basically family. She is the only reason I have a family or a career or any life worth being proud of at all. I felt tears come freely then, the particular release of finally hearing, spoken plainly and correctly in front of someone who mattered, the truth I'd carried quietly for so many years. Riverside Orthodontics rebuilt steadily over the following year, considerably more modest in certain ways than it had been during its most image-conscious period, but honest in a way I think it had never quite managed to be before. Bradley reported his finances to Frank faithfully, without complaint, and slowly, carefully, began building something that felt, watching him from a careful distance, considerably more solid than anything Preston Caldwell's approval had ever offered him. I think about that garden party often, sitting now at my own kitchen table with my son across from me, ordinary and unremarkable in exactly the way I once feared I'd never get to experience with him again. I think about the particular sting of those 4 words, basically family, and how close I came to simply absorbing that erasure indefinitely, the same way I'd absorbed so many smaller ones before it, rather than finally, firmly insisting on being seen for exactly who I actually was. I learned that love without boundaries teaches people exactly how little they need to acknowledge you in return, and that protecting someone's character sometimes requires taking away the comfort that's been quietly corroding it. What I gained in the end wasn't just my son's practice stake restored, or even his renewed presence at my own table, though both matter to me more than I can properly express. It was a son who finally introduced me correctly and completely as exactly who I have always been, and a mother who learned at 70 that patience is only a virtue right up until the moment it becomes its own quiet form of self-erasure.